Hey guys, James with TFBTV, and today on TFBTV we're looking at the Raddest Guns from the 1980s. The 80s kicked ass. I could come home after school, Mom would make me some chicken nuggets, I could kick it with G.I. Joe and an Ecto Cooler, and don't lie, you guys know you watched Gem too.
Showtime synergy.
Magnum P.I. was played by pro-gun actor Tom Selleck, and he was showing everyone how to wear shorts properly. MacGyver was bodacious, shoulder holsters were still in, synthwave was hot, and Michael Jackson was still black. And alive. Then 1990 happened, and it brought us Blossom and Beanie Babies and chat rooms and Jinkos, and all of a sudden cocaine started being bad for you. Need I say more? The 80s were dope. So today on TFB TV, we are throwing it back to the 1980s. The 80s were awesome, so it stands to reason that the guns of the 80s were pretty awesome too. These are guns that were all invented between 1980 and 1989, and they are rad. Those are the criteria. These are the 5 most rad. We may as well call this the Miami Vice episode because every badass 80s gun was on Miami Vice. If your gun was made in the 80s and it wasn't on Miami Vice, it was simply not rad, chance of suck. You know who used rad guns? Sonny Crockett. And you know what gun Sonny Crockett used? Originally, the plan was that Crockett was going to use a Browning BDA or a SIG P220, very similar guns. But after the pilot episode, the producers of Miami Vice decided that Don Johnson needed something more high-tech. That is, something invented in the 80s. So they made the call to equip Crockett with a Bren 10. It was a brand new, state-of-the-art handgun made for the brand new, state-of-the-art 10mm cartridge. The president of Galco even flew down to Miami and custom fitted a shoulder holster for Don Johnson for the Bren 10 on set. That holster came to be known as the Miami Classic as an homage to the show Miami Vice, which was in and of itself an homage to the 1980s. And some cow who had no idea how lucky he was got to take one between the eyes so his skin could serve as a scabbard for the first ever pistol in 10mm. The Bren 10, used by Don fucking Johnson in Miami fucking Vice. The Bren 10 was a two-tone gun, but actually the producers wanted it in all chrome, so it would stand out a little bit better during night filming and night shooting. But between just us, that is me and the million subscribers out there, I was a little disappointed to find out that the Bren 10 used by Crockett was really chambered in 45 ACP, just because no one made blank. God damn it, Josephine. I was a little disappointed to find out that the Bren 10 used by Crockett on the set of Miami Vice was really just chambered in 45 ACP, and that's because no one made blanks for a caliber that had been just invented, the 10mm. The Bren 10 shares some cues with the CZ75, but notwithstanding their very similar appearance, it's not a clone. In fact, that may have been what killed the Bren 10. It did have some cool features like a 45 conversion kit and even a screwdriver built into the recoil rod that would work on all of the screw heads on the gun. But ultimately, the Bren 10 was criticized for being too heavy, too complex. So even with Big Dick Don representing on my vibe, Darnus and Dixon, the company that made the Bren 10, went out of business in 1986. Smith & Wesson seized on an opportunity to license their excellent 645 for the show. Crockett started carrying the Smith & Wesson 645 in the same Miami Classic Galco holster, and it was Smith's time to shine. The Model 645 was Smith's first commercial 45 ACP semi-auto, and it was essentially designed to give a similar but more reliable performance to the 1911. It was about the same size and weight as a 1911 Government, with the same 5-inch barrel and an 8+1 capacity. The 645 was only made from 1985 to 1988, and it was eventually replaced with the Smith & Wesson 4506. This was done near the end of the show's run, and the change was made because they always wanted Crockett's character to be weapon savvy and a gun nerd and always on the cutting edge of firearm technology, which I think is kind of cool. So for number 5, we have a 3-way tie between the mighty Bren 10, the Smith & Wesson 645, and the Smith & Wesson 4506. The bottom line is if you were good enough for Crockett, you're good enough for TFBTV. All right, moving on to number 4. You guys know number 4 is my controversy slot. It's always my controversial pick. This time, that pick goes to the Uzi. This is controversial because the Uzi itself was invented in the 1940s, but the Uzi really hit its heyday in the 80s and is truly an icon of the decade. Fortunately, I can skate the Uzi in on a technicality because the Mini Uzi was invented in 1980 and the Micro Uzi was invented in 1986. The Mini Uzi, of course, is a smaller version of the legendary Uzi. It's just 14 inches long with the stock folded, but it still has an effective range of 100 meters due to its 8-inch barrel, which is longer, almost twice as long as the MP5K's 5-inch barrel, even though the Mini is in fact slightly shorter in terms of overall length than the MP5K. That's thanks to the fact that the chamber for the Uzi is right above the grip, as the magazine feeds through the grip. That was part of the deliberate design of the Uzi, mainly to make reloading more intuitive, especially in darkness or at night, since it worked fist to fist, very intuitive, like a pistol. This is opposed to the more conventional MP5 that has a magwell and a chamber in front of the grip. The Mini will also rock you like a hurricane with a blazing fast 1,000 round per minute cyclical rate, which is much faster than the 650 RPM from the standard Uzi. The Micro Uzi is of course even smaller, only 11 inches, with the stock folded. The Micro Uzi pushed the bounds of practicality with a blistering 1,200 round per minute cyclical rate. 1,200 RPM is so fast that it's basically unusable, especially out of a gun this small. The Micro Uzi can unleash its entire standard 20-round magazine in 1 second flat, and that's not hyperbole. I've shot both of these guns in full auto. The Mini's fun to shoot, while the Micro is basically a grip it, rip it, hold on for dear life affair, and if you hit anything, it's a bonus.
Should have leaned into that.
The Mini Uzi was used by some well-equipped and well-dressed drug dealers on Vice in 1985. And 80s gods Kurt Russell and Sylvester Stallone both used the Mini and Micro Uzi in 1989's Tango and Cash. The Mini and or the Micro were in RoboCop, The Punisher, License to Kill, The A-Team, even The Naked Gun. I love the scene where Priscilla Presley's like holding the Micro Uzi right under her chin. If she would have pulled the trigger on that thing, she would have looked like Lloyd Christmas the next day. The Uzi was, of course, used in Arnold movies Commando and The Running Man, which had Minis and Micros, and Chuck Norris used a Mini in Delta Force in 1986. The Mini was featured in the best Bond film of the 80s, The Living Daylights, as General Pushkin's henchmen were equipped with it. For what it's worth, I unironically listened to the eponymous song by a-ha, as The Living Daylights is not only the best Bond title track in the history of the films, but it's just a flat-out banger. The Uzi's are number 4 because its 1980s street cred resume is just too big to go in the fax machine. Moving on to number 3, the Desert Eagle. The Desert Eagle is perhaps one of the most well-known pistols of all time, and I mean among all people, not just gun people. If you walk up to some regular-ass dude on the street, ask his opinion, he's not going to say, "What you talking about, Willis?" He'll know what the Desert Eagle is. The Desert Eagle was invented in 1983, and its claim to fame is that it fires the largest round of any auto-loading handgun, the 50 Action Express. The 50 AE can fire a 300-grain projectile at 1,600 feet per second, making the 44 Magnum look like a little bitch in comparison. Coincidentally, all you have to do is change the barrel in the magazine from 50 AE, and you have a 44 Magnum. That's all it takes. It also has a link to our number 4 pick, the Uzi, as IMI, the manufacturer of the Uzi, made the Desert Eagle at first and for some time after its introduction. However, note that the first Desert Eagles that were introduced in 1983 were 357 Magnum. They worked up to 44 Magnum and then 50 AE in the subsequent years. The Desert Eagle's too powerful to function just like a regular handgun, so its operating system is something akin to what you would see like in a rifle. I mean, see that bolt, how it almost looks like an AK? In fact, at the risk of a very drastic oversimplification, it's almost like this gun uses an AK-47's operating system. It's got like a long stroke piston here that's attached to this rotating bolt with the bolt lugs on it. But that's part of the reason why this gun is so huge. It needs to have an operating system from a rifle to handle all the power that it generates. It weighs nearly 5 pounds, or as much as 3 Glock 19s. The Desert Eagle is one of the most pop culture prolific guns ever, and it's been featured in over 500 films, television shows, and video games. But what about in the 80s? Its first appearance in cinema was in 1985's Year of the Dragon. But the first movie it was in that was not a boring piece of shit was only a few weeks later in one of the best 80s movies. one of the best movies literally in the history of cinema, Commando. Who used it in that film? Arnie himself. And his character's name? John Matrix. And the most famous appearance of the Desert Eagle perhaps ever? The Matrix. Magnum Research playing that long-ass game with the Desert Eagle way back in the 80s. While it was seen in 80s classics like Police Academy, RoboCop, and The Punisher, it's safe to say that the Deagle became much, much more popular in later decades. The mark it has left on pop culture in the subsequent decades means that the Eagle effortlessly glides into the top 5 guns of the 80s. Like an eagle. Oh, and of course, it was featured in not 1, but 2 episodes of The Vice. Moving on to our number 2 pick, you all were waiting for it, the Tech-9. The infamous Intratec Tech-9 is a 9mm straight blowback operated semi-automatic SMG-style pistol commonly using a 32-round magazine. The Tech-9 was introduced in 1984. George Kellgren, the genius behind Kel-Tec, designed the Tech-9 and brought it to the American civilian market with the help of a man named Carlos Garcia. Think of it as like a semi-auto 80s update of the M3 grease gun from World War II. Using inexpensive construction, a straight blowback operating system, it was economically priced, but effective. It's colloquially referred to as a tube gun because it's designed with an upper receiver that's basically a section of metal tube with some holes in it. Sounds bad? Nothing wrong with it. The Tech-9 was made mostly of polymer and stamped steel parts. The simple design of the gun made it inexpensive to build, cheap to buy, and easy to repair. One could pick up a Tech-9 in 1989 for under $200, and a whopping 257,000 copies of the Tech-9 were sold. By the way, big shout out to my fellow writer at TFB, Nick Chen, for sending in his Tech-9 so I could use it in this video. While the Tech-9, for the most part, enjoys a reputation for being somewhat shitty, there was a brief period of time where the Tech-9 was working to its full design potential. The first run of the Tech-9 in 1984 had issues with the receiver cracking if hot, like plus P ammo was used in the gun. This was fixed with a redesign of the recoil buffer. I don't know when that happened, but the post-1984 redesigned Tech-9 is considered to be the best version of the original until 1987. That's when the company went bankrupt. The gun was tweaked again, allegedly to make it more cost-effective, and it ruined the gun's reliability. So why is this such a great 80s gun? Well, one reason would be Jack Burton in a movie called Big Trouble in Little China. In this, not racist at the time, classic, Kurt Russell skillfully wields the Tech-9, his 80s powers magnified by his dad jeans, mullet, and tucked-in graphic tank. Jack Burton was 80s drip personified. Don't you dare make fun of him. The Tech-9 was, pretty much for the only time, used by a protagonist of the film rather than like a villain extra for just a couple of screens. RoboCop, which was apparently like the Miami Vice of the silver screen as it comes to 80s guns, also featured the Tech-9 along with Beverly Hills Cop 2, and I think Serge may have been my inspiration to get into guns.
This is my booth, and it's the Survival Boutique. We are doing weapons and protective devices and products for survival in the helter-skelter world of today.
Naturally, Miami Vice featured it pretty heavily in the hands of henchmen, hitmen, drug dealers, you name it. The Tech-9 had the most 80s ad campaign ever. I've tried to find the old magazines to no avail. I mean, if you guys have one, send it in, please. Just a picture, I would love it. But it was always scantily clad hussies with their disgusting, awesome boobs just hanging out. And many people complain that the Tech-9 was deliberately marketed to gangsters because of its high capacity and its low cost. There was even an ad that said the Tech-9 was fingerprint resistant. The co-founder of Intratec, Mr. Garcia, told the Wall Street Journal that this meant that the finish stopped corrosion caused by skin oils. If you believe that, Garcia also said that escorts are not prostitutes and that this pipe is just for legal tobacco use. Ultimately, the gun raised too high of a profile and it became the Harvey Weinstein of guns. They were sued, banned, run out of business. That means even a fair condition Tech-9 will fetch $1,000 on Gunbroker as we sit here today. So if the Tech-9 is such a great design, why isn't it made anymore? Well, actually it is. Famed Swiss gunmaker B&T essentially remade the Tech-9, but as a premium Swiss-made submachine gun. It was basically the best rendition of the Tech-9. Like the Tech-9, the P-26 featured an alloy receiver tube with a lightweight polymer lower. It's ambidextrous, and it uses the same magazine as B&T's MP9 submachine gun. It has adjustable sights and a Picatinny optic rail. It also features pick rail mounting points for lights, lasers, and vertical foregrips near the muzzle end. It's got a combo threaded and 3-lugged barrel that will accommodate either standard direct thread silencers or tri-lug quick attach suppressors. Only 1,000 P26s were imported, and they were sold for under $1,000 each. These guns were the Tech 9 design perfected, and now they're collector's items. The P26 design was licensed by B&T to Beretta, who renamed the gun the PMX. The PMX is a full auto SMG for law enforcement only, and it has a beefier folding stock than the P26, but it's otherwise identical. I'm kind of hoping that either B&T or Beretta will think about bringing either of these models back to the US civilian market. And guys, I'm not even joking right now. Do me a favor, send B&T and Beretta customer service a link to this video and ask if they plan on making or re-releasing the P26 or the PMX ever again. And I'll bet they'll at least think about it if enough people do it. Moving on to my number one pick. Okay, don't act like you didn't know this was coming. I mean, the Glock is perhaps the most important handgun of the past century, like it or not. Don't boo me, you know I'm right. You're all gonna call me a Glock whore, which is not false. But if someone else like, say, Hickok 45 did this video, you'd be pissed if the Glock wasn't number one. But that video would be like top 5 guns for your 80s or something, not from the 80s. While I wouldn't say Glock is as iconic for the 80s the way the other guns in this list are, and Glock wasn't even the first polymer frame striker-fired handgun, Glock was the first one to do it and not suck bees, and it therefore became extremely popular because it did just about everything right. It was, and it remains, perhaps the most reliable pistol of all time. It's only made from 35 parts. The popular success of the Glock tipped off like this plastic gun hysteria. There were people who were primarily idiots who believed that, like, because you had a polymer frame on here, you could get a Glock through a security checkpoint or a metal detector at the airport. And of course, we all remember the line from Die Hard 2.
Punk pulled a Glock 7 on me. You know what that is? It's a porcelain gun made in Germany. Doesn't show up on your airport x-ray machines here, and it costs more than you make in a month.
That is all, of course, not true. What is true is that a tenacious Austrian man named Gaston Glock did what nobody else in the gun industry ever did before, and that is he consulted people who knew what the they were doing and asked them what they wanted to see in a pistol instead of just making a bunch of shit up and doing it by himself. By the way, here's me sitting in Gaston Glock's office chatting with his chief engineer, Joseph Croyer. Just gonna flex on your bitch ass with that real quick. Legend has it that Double G built a firing range in his basement to test the Glock 17 prototypes in the evenings. He also shot only with his left hand in case the gun blew up, so he'd still be able to use his dominant hand. So it isn't so much about the Glock being like an 80s gun like the Bren 10 or the Tech 9. It was only in a couple movies in the 1980s. It's about the shockwave that Glock sent through the industry after being produced and popularized in the 80s that makes it the ultimate gun of the decade. Glock sold its 5 millionth pistol in 2007, and over 65% of federal, state, and local agencies in the United States have been issued a Glock pistol. Its first appearance on screen, TV, movie, or otherwise was, you probably guessed it, Different Strokes. No, I'm kidding, we all know Gary Coleman was the Smith & Wesson guy. The Glock appeared in the Season 3 episode of Miami Vice, Cuba Libre, where one of the Cuban rebels carried the then brand new Glock 17, or as he probably called it, the Los 17. This was Glock's first ever appearance in media and the only time I'm aware of that it was in a 1980s TV show. If you've got the retro Glock bug, then fire up your Duran Duran playlist, head over to Baton Rouge where Lipsy's has been, they may be done by now, but they've been importing relatively faithful copies of the P80, the predecessor of the Glock 17, and they've been doing it with Glock's blessing. The new P80 has all the features and looks of the original while maintaining some of the more modern touches of the newer Glocks, like the more sophisticated slide coatings. Check my video from a few months ago when I got to handle and shoot one of the first copies of the relaunched P80 in the country. Well, guys, that's all I got for you today. Thanks for joining me on this very special episode of TFBTV. The 80s were rad, but you know what kicks even more ass? You guys. As well as our sponsors, Blue Alpha and your online shooting sports superstore, Top Gun Supply. That's it for me. I am going back to the future.
Synergy.